Hello and welcome back to my channel, Amoeba Savant. I'm reading Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. This is chapter 4. It's called The Third Son, Alyosha, which I love that name from Anna Karenina. I haven't read the book yet. Maybe that will be on the list, but the movie is really good with Keira Knightley. It's a very interesting artistic take for sure. Anyway, chapter 4. He was then only 20, his brother Ivan was 23, and their older brother Dmitri 27. First, I want to make it clear that young Alyosha was in no sense a fanatic. In my opinion, at least, he was not even a mystic. Let me tell you my opinion of him right from the start. He was just a boy who very early in life had come to love his fellow men, and if he chose to enter a monastery, it was simply because at one point that course had caught his imagination, and he had become convinced that it was the ideal way to escape from the darkness of the wicked world, a way that would lead him toward light and love. This particular way had caught his attention only because he had happened to meet a man who made an overwhelming impression on him, the famous Zosima, the elder of our monastery, to whom he had become attached with all the ardor of the first love kindled in his insatiable heart. I will not deny, however, that he was already rather strange even then, because he had been strange from the cradle. As I have already mentioned, he was just 3 when he lost his mother, yet he always remembered how she looked and how she caressed him, quote, just as if she were standing alive before me, he would say. Such memories can be preserved, as everyone knows, from an even earlier age, even in a 2-year-old, but they are like bright spots standing out in the darkness, a tiny lighted fragment of a huge canvas, while the rest of the painting remains faded and dark. So it was with Alyosha. I have memories of that, like that, of my uncle Tomek, who passed away when he was 17 and I was 4. He remembered a certain evening, a quiet summer evening, an open window, the slanting rays of the setting sun. The slanting rays were the clearest part of his recollection. An icon with a lighted lamp in a corner of the room, and kneeling before the icon his mother, sobbing hysterically, screaming and shrieking, clutching him with both hands so tightly that it hurt, praying to the Mother of God for him, then holding him away from her toward the icon, as if putting him under the protection of the Mother of God. Then, all of a sudden, a nanny rushes into the room and snatches him away from his mother in alarm. Ah, that picture. Alyosha always remembered the way his mother's face had looked at that second. He described it as both frenzied and beautiful. But he rarely confided this recollection, and to very few people. As a child and as a boy, Alyosha was rather reserved, one might even say uncommunicative. He was not distrustful, however, or shy or unsociable, just the opposite, in fact. His apparently distant behavior was due to a constant inner preoccupation with something strictly personal, something which had nothing to do with other people, but which was so supremely important to him that it made him forget the rest of the world. But he certainly loved people. Throughout his life, he seemed to believe in people and trust them, and yet no one ever thought him simple-minded or naive. There was something in him, and it stayed with him all his life, that made people realize that he refused to sit in judgment of others, that he felt he had no right to, and that, whatever happened, he would never condemn anyone. He gave the impression that he could witness anything without feeling in the least outraged, although he might be deeply saddened. Indeed, even when he was still very young, he reached a point where nothing either shocked or horrified him. So when at the age of 19, chaste and pure, he was faced with the shocking debauchery in his father's house, he would walk away in silence when things became too revolting, but never show the slightest sign of scorn or condemnation. His father, because earlier in life he had scrounged off other people, had developed a special sensitivity to people's attitudes and was prepared to interpret anything as a personal slur. So at first he viewed Alyosha with gruff distrust. The fellow doesn't say much, but he is thinking all kinds of things underneath. Within 2 weeks, however, he was constantly hugging and kissing his son. True, the tears that rolled down his cheeks at these times were drunken tears, and the outpourings that punctuated his embraces were those of a besotted sentimentality. Yet it was obvious that the old man had come to love his son deeply and sincerely. In fact, his feelings for Alyosha were such as a man like him could never have expected to have for anyone. But then everybody liked the boy wherever he went, from his early childhood on. When he found himself in the house of Mr. Polenov, his guardian and benefactor, the whole household became attached to him as if he were one of the family. And it must be remembered that when Alyosha was first brought there, he was very young and cannot have set out to gain their affection calculatingly, by trying to please or by cunning flattery. The gift of making people love him was inherent in him. He gained people's affection directly and effortlessly. It was part of his nature. And it was the same at school, although one would have thought him the kind of boy to provoke distrust in his comrades, to become the target of their jokes and sometimes even of their hatred. For instance, he would often become absorbed in his thoughts and, as it were, withdraw from the world. Even as a very small boy, he would go off into a quiet corner and read a book. And yet, his schoolfellows liked him so much that it can be said that he was the most popular boy in the school all the time he was there. He was seldom playful, or, for the matter, even merry, but a look at him was sufficient to see that there was nothing sullen about him. That, on the contrary, he was a bright, good-tempered boy, and he never tried to show off to the other boys, perhaps because he was never afraid of anyone. Yet the boys felt right away that he was in no way proud of his fearlessness, that it never even occurred to him that he was fearless or bold. He also never held a grudge when someone offended him. An hour later he would answer the offender or speak to him himself, with a trustful, friendly look as if nothing had happened. And it wasn't that he had forgotten or, having thought it over, had decided to forgive the insult. It was simply that he no longer felt offended. It was this trait that won all the boys over to him and made them love him. He had, however, one peculiarity that throughout his school years incited his comrades to tease him, not because they were mean, but just because they found it funny. This was a fierce, frantic modesty and chastity. He could not bear to hear dirty words or a certain type of talk about women. Unfortunately, though, such words and such talk are inevitable at school. Boys, pure at heart, mere children, often whisper in class or even say certain things aloud and describe certain scenes that even soldiers would hesitate to mention. For one thing, there is much that soldiers do not know or understand that is quite familiar to very young boys in our intellectual and upper classes. In this there can hardly be moral depravity or perverted inner cynicism as yet, but there is that outward cynicism which they consider truly refined and subtle, something daring and worthy of emulation. When the other boys realized that Alyosha Karamazov stopped up his ears as soon as they started talking about those things, they would crowd around him, tear his hands away, and scream obscenities into his ears, while Alyosha tried to break away, throwing himself onto the ground, trying desperately to cover his ears with his hands, struggling without a word, bearing it all in complete silence. In the end, however, they left him in peace and stopped calling him little girl, at most feeling a little sorry for him for being so peculiar in that respect. I must mention, by the way, that although academically Alyosha was always among the top students, he was never actually the first in his class. When Polenov died, Alyosha still had 2 years to go at the secondary school of the province. Very shortly after losing her husband, the inconsolable widow took all her daughters, they had no sons, on a long trip to Italy, sending Alyosha to live with 2 ladies who were distant relatives of Mr. Polenov's. Alyosha, who had never seen them before, did not know what the financial arrangements were. This was another trait that was very characteristic of him. He never cared whose money he lived on. In this respect he was a striking contrast to his brother Ivan, who worked hard to support himself during his first 2 years at the university rather than ask for help, and who had been painfully aware ever since his childhood of living on the charity of strangers. I do not think Alyosha should be judged too severely on this account, however, for he was quite obviously one of those childlike, saintly creatures who, if he were suddenly to come into a large fortune, would think nothing of giving it all away to some good cause, or simply to the first clever rascal who asked for it. In general, he did not seem to know the value of money. I do not mean that literally, of course, but when he was given pocket money, for which he never asked, he either kept it for weeks on end without knowing what to do with it, or spent it at once on anything. After observing Alyosha for some time, Peter Musov, who set great store by bourgeois respectability and was very punctilious in money matters, passed the following somewhat paradoxical judgment on him. Alyosha, Musov declared, may be the only man in the world who, if left all by himself in the middle of a strange city inhabited by 1,000,000 unknown people, would never suffer from cold or hunger, for he would immediately be offered food and shelter, and if no one offered him anything, he would find everything he needed right away himself, and it would cost him no effort, nor make him feel in the least humiliated, nor, for that matter, would he be imposing himself on others. Just the contrary, they would all be only happy to do things for him. Alyosha did not finish school. When he was still a year away from graduation, he told the ladies he lived with that he had to go and see his father to discuss an idea that had occurred to him. The two ladies, who were sorry to lose him, tried in vain to persuade him to stay. Since it was not an expensive journey, he planned to pay for it by pawning his watch, a parting gift from Mrs. Polenov, but the two ladies wouldn't hear of it. They gave him a goodly sum of money and, in addition, bought him a complete wardrobe. Alyosha, however, returned half the money, assuring them he preferred to travel third class. When he first arrived in our town, his father questioned him suspiciously, trying to find out just what had brought him here before he had finished school. Instead of answering, Alyosha plunged into his private thoughts, as he so often did. It soon became clear that he was seeking his mother's grave, and he himself practically confirmed that this had been his real reason for coming. But it can hardly have been the only reason. Most likely at that time he did not really know himself why he had come, not being quite sure what it was that was driving him. A peculiar yearning had arisen in his heart, drawing him irresistibly into a new, unknown, but by then inevitable course. Mr. Karamazov was unable to show his son where he had buried his second wife, for, once the coffin had been lowered into the earth, he had never returned to visit her grave, and, since that had been many years before, he had entirely forgotten where the grave was. Moreover, Mr. Karamazov had been away from our town for a long time. 3 or 4 years after his second wife's death, he had gone to the south of Russia, ending up in Odessa, where he stayed for several years. There he came across lots of yids of all shapes and sizes, as he put it, and even got to know not only yids but respectable Jews as well. It was probably during this period of his life that he developed a special knack for making money and holding on to it. He had returned to our town to stay only about 3 years before Alyosha came. Those who had known him before found him terribly aged, although he was still by no means an old man. His behavior was somehow different, too. It wasn't that he'd become more dignified, but he was more self-assured, even insolent. This former buffoon, for instance, now took an impotent delight in making buffoons of others, but his depravity with women was as bad as ever, if anything, worse. Within a short time he opened a number of new taverns in the district. It looked as if he was worth 100,000 rubles or close to it. Many people in town and throughout the district started borrowing money from him, on good security, of course. Of late, however, he had looked rather bloated and seemed to be losing his hold on himself. He had even slipped into a sort of light-headedness. He was unable to keep his mind on any one thing, but would skip off onto something else. He would become confused, and more often he drank himself into a stupor. If it hadn't been for that same servant Gregory, who looked after him almost like a nanny, and who had also aged considerably, Karamazov might not even have survived. Alyosha's arrival seemed to restore some of his mental vigor, and even to stir up a scrap of decency that had been buried somewhere in this prematurely aged man. "You know what," he would often say, examining Alyosha's face closely. "You're just like her, just like that crazy woman. Just like the crazy woman." That was his way of referring to Alyosha's mother, his late second wife. It was Gregory who finally showed Alyosha where the crazy woman was buried. He took Alyosha to a far corner of our cemetery, where he pointed out a cheap but decently kept grave with an iron headstone bearing the name of the deceased, the dates of her birth and death, and even an ancient 4-line verse such as is often found on the tombs of lower middle-class folk. Strange as it may seem, the gravestone turned out to be Gregory's doing. He had it placed on the poor crazy woman's grave at his own expense after Mr. Karamazov, whom he had repeatedly plagued about it, finally left for Odessa without doing anything, turning his back not only on his wife's grave, but on all his memories as well. Alyosha showed no particular emotion at the sight of his mother's grave. After listening attentively to Gregory's dignified and precise account of the erection of the gravestone, he stood there for a while, his head bowed, then walked away without a word. And it was perhaps a whole year before he visited the grave again. But when Mr. Karamazov heard about the episode, his reaction was quite unexpected. He all of a sudden donated 1,000 rubles to our monastery for requiem masses to be said for the soul of his wife. Not for his second wife, though, not for Alyosha's mother, the poor crazy woman, but for his first wife, Adelaida, the one who used to beat him. Then later that night he got drunk and started abusing the monks to Alyosha. Mr. Karamazov had never been a religious man, and it may be that until then he had never even placed a 5-kopeck candle before an icon. But then such characters are sometimes swept up in some unexpected idea or impulse. As I mentioned earlier, Karamazov's face had grown bloated and showed unmistakable traces of the life he led. Besides the heavy fleshy bags under his eternally insolent, suspicious, mocking little eyes, besides the multitude of tiny wrinkles on his small, flabby face, his large, meaty Adam's apple hung under his sharp chin shaped like a purse, and this somehow gave him a repulsively sensual air. Add to this a carnivorous mouth with puffy lips and the black stumps of almost completely decayed teeth, from which saliva sprayed every time he opened his mouth to speak. He often made fun of his appearance himself, although on the whole he seemed quite satisfied with it. He particularly liked to point to his nose, which, though not very long, was remarkably narrow and beaked. "It is a genuine Roman nose," he would say, "and with my Adam's apple it makes me look like a Roman patrician of the decadent period." He seemed very proud of this. Shortly after he had been shown his mother's grave, Alyosha suddenly announced to his father that he wanted to enter the monastery and that the monks were willing to accept him as a novice. He explained that this was his fervent desire and that he was asking for paternal consent. Mr. Karamazov was already aware of the impression made by the elder Zosima, who was living in the monastery's Hermitage, on his gentle boy. Old Zosima, certainly the most honest among the monks, he said, after listening to Alyosha's request in thoughtful silence. He seemed hardly surprised. So that's what you want, my gentle boy?" He had been drinking, and suddenly his face dissolved into a wide, half-drunken smile, in which there was a spark of besotted cunning. You may not believe it, but I've had a feeling for a long time that you'd come up with something like this in the end." "Well, if that's what you want, I have no objections. You have those 2,000 rubles of your own for dowry if you need it, and for my part, you can be sure I'll never let you down. I'll even pay for your admission if they ask for it. Of course, if they don't ask for it, there's no reason for us to force it on them, is there? Why, you're no more expensive to keep than a canary. 2 grains a week, that's all you need." Now let me tell you that I know of a monastery with a nice little settlement nearby inhabited only by women, the monastery wives. That's what the people of the district call them, for everyone knows about it. I'd say there are 30 of those wives in the settlement. I've been there, and it was very interesting in its own way, of course, just as a change. It's a bit spoilt by Russian nationalism, though. There's still not a single French woman there, although they could easily afford some. It's a very prosperous monastery indeed, but French girls will soon hear of it, and they'll come of their own accord. But there's nothing like that in our monastery. No monastery wives, although there are 200 monks. It's all honest. They keep their fasts. Well, I must say, so you want to be a monk? I'm certainly sorry you want to leave, Alyosha. It's surprising how attached to you I've become. It will have one advantage, though. You can pray for us sinners, for we may have gone too far in our sinning. Yes, sir, I've wondered for a long time whether anyone would ever pray for me, whether there was a man in the world who would want to. Ah, my dear boy, you wouldn't believe how stupid I am on that point. Awfully stupid. But stupid as I am about these things, I do think of them now and then, for you wouldn't expect me to think of them all the time, would you? Well then, sometimes I reason like this. As soon as I die, the devils are sure to drag me down to their place with their hooks. But then I think, what hooks? What are they made of? Are they iron hooks? If so, where were they forged? Do they have some kind of ironworks down there, or what? Why, I'm sure the monks in the monastery take it for granted that hell has, for instance, a ceiling. But it would be easier for me to imagine a hell without a ceiling. That would be more refined, more enlightened, more Lutheran, that is. And what difference does it make whether hell has a ceiling or not? Oh no, it damn well makes all the difference in the world, because if there's no ceiling, there aren't any hooks either. And if there aren't any hooks, then the whole idea goes to pieces. And that too is hard to believe, because if they're not going to drag me down to hell, what justice is there in the world? No, even if they didn't exist, those hooks, il faudrait les inventer, even especially for me, because you can't even begin to imagine, my boy, all the disgraceful things I've done. But there are no hooks there, Alyosha said quietly and seriously, looking attentively at his father. I know. Just the shadows of hooks. I've heard the story. It's like that Frenchman's description of hell. J'ai vu l'ombre d'un cocher qui avec l'ombre d'un brosse frottait l'ombre d'un carrosse. And how do you know, my dear boy, that there are no hooks? We'll see that tune you sing after you've spent a while with those monks. Still, while you're there, try to find out the truth, and when you do, come and tell me what's what. It will be easier to leave for the other world if I know what to expect there. Besides, it will be more seemly for you to live in the monastery than to stay here with an old drunkard like me, and with all these sluts, though nothing could sully you, clean angel that you are. Well, I trust there will be nothing to sully you there either, and that's why I'm letting you go. Why, devils haven't eaten your brains after all, and if you're all afire to go there now, it'll burn off in good time, cool off. You'll get over it and come back to me. And I'll be waiting for you here, because I know you're the only person on earth who hasn't condemned me. I feel it. I can't help feeling it. And he even wept. He was sentimental. He was wicked and sentimental. Thank you for listening. That was chapter 4 of the Brothers Karamazov. Please subscribe and like the video, and I'll see you in the next video where I read chapter 5. Bye.